Welcome, everybody. Can you hear me? Is this better than when I tried it before? Okay. My name is Becky Carlton, and I'm a program specialist here at the Johnson County Library, and it is an honor to see your faces here in this space, all of you writers. It's just a joy to be in community with you. So I want to say a few things before we get started. As we come together today, we acknowledge that this land has long been home to indigenous peoples who have stewarded it for generations. We recognize and honor the Kanza, Kaskaskia, Kickapoo, Osage, Peoria, Sioux, and Shawnee tribes, and acknowledge their continued presence, resilience, and cultural contributions. May we engage with this space, this place, with awareness, respect, and a commitment to learning from the past as we create together in the present. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. This session is called Making Sense of Experiences, Writing to Understand the Self with Aisha Sharif, who is here with us. Welcome. Aisha Sharif is a Cave Canem fellow who earned her MFA at Indiana University, Bloomington, and BA in English at Rhodes College. Her poetry has appeared in Crab Orchard Review, Tidal Basin Review, Callaloo, Calyx, Rattle, and other literary journals. Her poems have been nominated for Pushcart Prizes in 2019 and 2015. Her first book of poetry, To Keep From Undressing, was published by SparkWheel Press in 2019. Her second book, Black Diamonds, was a finalist for the 2024 HubCity Press BIPOC Series. So help me welcome Aisha Sharif. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm excited to be here and to share another workshop with you all entitled Making Sense of Experiences, Writing to Understand the Self. I had a little bio there, but it was already presented, so I'll just keep going. When we think about writing, I'll just jump right in. When we think about writing, we can talk about the aspects of craft, we can talk about aspects of form and how to do it. And those are all really great questions and things to think about, right? But then the issue is, well, what if I don't really know what I want to write about, right? And so that's the fundamental premise of this workshop, right? Before you get into the how of the craft, right, we need to have some understanding of what it is that we want to write about, right? And so here are some seminal questions that I think as writers we're faced with. What is your story, right? What is your character's story? How do we know which experiences have shaped us or are going to shape our character? So if some of us are creative nonfiction writers or poets, sometimes we think back on our own lives and wonder, what is it that I want to write about? Right? And if you're a fiction author or even a poet, sometimes you might have a character in your story, right? And you might want to think about, okay, what is going to motivate this character? What is this character's story? And so how can we connect those experiences to start our poem, our verse, our story, or to start a character's story? So these are some fundamental questions that this workshop is kind of built upon, right? How do we get started? How do we make sense of all the things in our lives in order to produce that piece of work, right? So I actually did a workshop earlier today on the abecedarian, right? And using the abecedarian as a tool to help us shape our narrative. But what if we don't know what our narrative is, right? So this is a workshop that can help us on that foundational level, right? Hopefully that's understandable there. Okay, so I'm going to use myself as a model for this process. I'm a teacher. I teach English in so many different facets, creative writing, composition. So I always like to model for my students what it is that I'm talking about. And so I was posed with this question myself: what is my story? I wanted to write about, and I still like to write about, my childhood experiences, right? That's something that we all have in common. We can all say at one point we were a child, right? Unless we were some alien life form, okay? And so I think about, okay, I was born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee. I'm Muslim, I'm African American, my parents converted to Islam. I attended a school where I was the only Muslim, in public school. Where do I begin, right? I know that this is important to my life, right? That my therapist says so, right? But what do I do with all of this information? It can appear to be overwhelming at some point, right? Like, where do I start? So I just kind of wrote this stuff down on some notes in a journal, right? And I remember attending a workshop during Cave Canem, which was mentioned before. Cave Canem is a poetry retreat for certain African Americans, and back, I think this was several years ago, in like 2012 perhaps, Nikki Finney, who at the time was the winner of the 2011 National Book Award for her book Head Off and Split, she was my workshop leader on one of those days. And she gave me some really amazing story building advice because I wrote a poem that was trying to explain something that happened to me when I was in middle school, called it junior high then. And it was all over the place, right? And, she was like, what are you trying to say here? What is the significance of this moment for you, right? And I was like, I don't really know. Can you help me? So she gave me some advice that I'm going to pass on to you all that I have felt is very, very helpful. She talked about story and intersectionality, right? She talked about stories and character building that are based primarily on what happened, okay? Right? A good story is based on identity building, okay? And so when I was writing this poem, I wanted to write about something that, was happening in the middle school time, and I was just like writing, and I was talking about my dad, and I was talking about this, and she's like, think less about this is what happened and more about how this builds something within you. And so this aspect of intersectionality is important. According to legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, intersectionality is recognizing overlapping or intersecting social identities, particularly minority identities, and how structures make certain identities the consequence of and vehicle for vulnerability. What does all that mean? Basically, that we don't live in a vacuum, okay? When you're thinking about writing about your life or a character's life, you can't just decide to represent yourself in this one moment, right? On this one day. Because that one moment on that one day, even though it might be significant, is always tied to something else, right? Something bigger, right? Some aspect of intersectionality has to be present in order to make this experience connect with the reader, but also to matter for it to be written about and shared, right? So thinking about your experience as something that is overlapping and intersecting with something else, right? Either something else in your life or something else that's happening outside of your world, right? Because again, no man is an island. We are always impacted by things that are unfolding around us. So Nikki Finney told me I have to change my mindset, right? I can't just think about, oh, I want to talk about this one time when this happened, right? It's, oh, I want to talk about this one time that happened, but also in connection with other things that enrich that one moment. Because the reason why you remembered it is not just because it's isolated, it's because it's actually connected, quite the opposite, okay? So I'm going to break that down a little bit more. right? So for those visual learners, right, you think about this diagram here, right, where the circles are intersecting, right? My identity and resulting experiences are intersectional, right? So my writing must also be intersectional, right? I must layer some things together. Content mirrors form, right? That's one of the biggest things that I've learned as a creative writer, right? What you write about is connected to how you write it, and how you write it impacts what you write. So we want to layer narratives to mirror the layers of identity. So layering narratives to mirror the layers of your identity. Okay. We good? No, this might be a lot. Any questions so far? Okay, this will all make sense. Okay, so in order to figure out your story or your character story or the experiences that you want to, write about, sketch out your background, okay? But in a manner that shows connectedness between events, okay? It's one thing to do a nice free write or brainstorming, just dump it out there, right? I did that with the people who attended my workshop for the Abecedarian workshop, right? Sometimes you just need to do a word dump, right? Or a memory dump. Once you've done that, though, sometimes it's important to go back and apply some structure, right? Because even though the word dump, the free write, the brainstorm can still be overwhelming, right? Okay, so what is this gonna look like, right? Nikki Finney told me, go home, Aisha, stop writing the poem. Just stop it, girl. Regroup. And she told me to write 3 columns on a piece of paper. If you wanted to do this electronically, this is how it would kind of look, okay? She said, you're gonna make 3 columns. 1 for personal, 1 for local, and 1 for global, okay? 3 columns, personal, local, and global. And then you're going to think of all of the significant years of your life, from the day that you were born until present, okay? And for every significant year, you're going to write down what was going on in your life on a personal level, what was happening locally, like in your city or your town or your school, maybe your state, and then also what was happening during that same year on a global level or national level, okay? And she said, you need to do this for your whole life. I said, my whole life? What? She said, your whole life, do it. And I said, that's gonna take a long time. And she said, so, do it, right? This is the writing process, right? And so I did it. Right? I started with the year I was born, 1981, and at this time, this was 2012, so my chart stopped in 2012, right? But you all would go up until, we would all do it again for 2025, right? And so you have to think, okay, obviously everyone's gonna write down for that first year, I was born, right? But think about, okay, what else happened? And maybe you don't write down something for every single year, right? Maybe you skip a couple of years, because as you can see, I skipped a few years here. I did 1981, and then the next one was 1986, right? But I realized, okay, 1981, I was born. All right. I did that, right? But that was also the year that my father converted from Christianity to Islam. That's pretty darn significant, okay? And even though I didn't have a hand in that, that was still personally affecting me, right? So you can also write down things that perhaps parents did, siblings did, but it was central to your personal life, okay? And then locally, this is locally and nationally and globally, that's where you might have to do some research, right? Good old Google will come in handy, right? What was happening in my city in 1981? Well, you know, I am from Memphis, Tennessee, and in 1982, roughly around the same time, they built this really big attraction called Mud Island. The Mississippi River runs through Memphis, and so that was this big, you know, attraction there, and it still is. And then also I researched globally what was happening. Okay, the assassination attempt on the Pope. Oh my gosh, wow. And then we finally named AIDS, right? And then there was the first woman on the Supreme Court that happened in 1981. All right, so these are just things that you do, right? You go down the line and you just write all the stuff that's personal, local, global. You're not trying to do anything with this information at this point, right? You're just cataloging. And the desire for you will want to be to do something with this, but just be patient, right? Because we need to just see visually what is happening, right? Does this make sense a little bit? It's really interesting because I was like, oh my gosh, right? Let me sit back and look what was happening, right? In 1989, that's when I attended this Islamic school for the first time. But then globally, the Berlin Wall is falling. Wow, right? So after you do all of this cataloging, you look up all this stuff, right? Then you can sit back and you say, okay, now I need to do some connections. I need to start seeing where things overlap, right? And so she said, okay, now look at a year. Now you start to look across this grid, okay? Look at what's happening personally and globally and locally for every year, right? And you'll start to see some connections. And I'm like, I don't really see how the Berlin Wall ties into me having a crush at my school. I don't see that at all, right? But she's like, you're thinking too hard. Stop it. You're trying to make the connection too quickly, okay? So this is an exercise in patience, right? This does not happen out of like one day or even a week, right? This was a process that took several months for me. Even just coming up with this chart took it took about, several weeks. And then I put it away. Step away from it, right? It's okay to just let something sit, right? Because we might try too hard, right? And then come back to it. And so when I was coming back to it and I was looking across, 1994 stood out to me. She said, okay, look to see where the personal, the local, and the global seem to overlap, even if it's just the aspect of one common thread, okay? So in 1984, it stood out to me because of the significance of some stuff that was happening to me personally. So I'm Muslim, right? And I was going to this public school, and I was also wearing the hijab. That was a time in 1984 where this boy pulled my scarf off in gym class. Never forgotten that. It was quite traumatic. I didn't realize how traumatic it was until after writing this poem. But that was also the year that my father went to Hajj. And Hajj for Muslims is this holy pilgrimage to Mecca, which is in Saudi Arabia. And Muslims are encouraged to do it if you have the physical and economic means to do it. And so my father did it in 1994. And then I was also playing tennis, okay? And so I was looking across, and I saw, okay, there was this trolley that was built in Memphis. Okay, interesting. Then I also saw in the global realm the World Trade Center bombing. I was like, wow, that was done by Muslims, or people who claim to be Muslim. I was like, interesting. And then the Rwandan genocide, and then Lorena Bobbitt. If you know, you know, right? So I was like, let me steer away from that, right? I'm not gonna judge that a little bit. But what was interesting was this World Trade Center bombing, right? And the first, because there's been two, right? The first one was in 94, or around that time. And so I was like, this boy pulling my scarf off, Islam, Trade Center bombing, interesting. how can I make sense of that, right? So if I'm thinking back on Nikki Finney's advice about how nothing happens within a vacuum, right? We're all connected, right? I want to write about this incident of this boy pulling my scarf off because I have never written about that, and it was actually really emotional for me, right? So am I going to sit down and just write about that by itself? No, I'm going to try and pull in some things outside of that, like the World Trade Center bombing. And there's something about my father, too, going on this pilgrimage, because I'm realizing this all pertains back to some aspects of faith and Islam. Don't know how, right? But it's okay. I'm now going to do this other page where I'm sitting down and I'm making some connections. This is me like talking out loud to you, but in a written format, right? Boy pulls off my hijab in 7th grade, okay?
Are you in a public school now?
I'm in a public school now, yes. This would never have happened in an Islamic school. Hope not. And I had attended an Islamic school previously, right? And the Islamic school were all people of color, right? And the person who pulled my scarf off was white and Christian, right? So I'm writing this down, I'm thinking, okay, this is kind of deep, right? Because now I'm realizing there's some differences with aspects of race. But if I had written this without doing this, I would never have thought about pulling up this aspect of racial difference, right? Or even the fact that I had come from the Islamic school. I would have just thought about it, oh, on this one day this happened, right? So slowing down and realizing that made me think about the before the event as well. Also, I realized in public school, I don't know if this happens anymore, but I was in Latin class. Do they still offer Latin? No, it's unfortunate. I loved it. And I was like, why is Latin important? Because I fell in love with the goddess of Artemis. I think she's also Diana, maybe, who is the goddess of the hunt, right, and female freedom. And I was like, okay, do you guys see some connections here? Right? This goddess was female freedom. I was in Latin class. This boy pulls off my scarf. And then this World Trade Center bombing. How in the world is Nikki Finney saying that I need to connect that in this? Like, what? Right? But then I'm pushing myself. Okay, so I went to YouTube and I started looking at the old news coverage. I'm not showing this now, but I have like notes and notes and notes about this first World Trade Center bombing and how the news covered them and these people and the hate and the revenge that these attempted terrorists had, right? And then my father's religious pilgrimage. Okay, I look exactly like my father. Like, it's kind of embarrassing because I'm like a girl, right? I look exactly like him. We have very similar personalities. Okay, Freud is talking in my mind right now, right? So he's on this pilgrimage, and so I'm thinking about, okay, this is really deep, right? All of these things are happening within the same year, even though it's not happening in the same week or day or month. That doesn't really matter. But I'm realizing, looking back on this, that there is some connections, right? And there's a theme of aspects of faith and freedom and gender, maybe even race, okay? Do we follow this a little bit, right? But again, would never have thought about that without doing that chart, okay? So here's the activity that you would do as well, but I've kind of already explained this a little bit. And then that's what I did myself. Let me see. So it would kind of look like this if you wanted to keep going. Right. Okay. So what I'm going to do right now is pause, and I'm going to actually show you the poem that I created from this activity. I went through several drafts of this poem.
Is the Hajj, is the trip to Mecca, is can that be at any time of year or
No.
a specific?
It's a specific time of the year and a specific month. Yeah. I can't remember when he actually went though. Yeah. It's a lunar calendar in Islam, so it changes all the time. So it's never the same month. It's not like, oh, it's always in December. 1 year it could be in December, and 5 years later it could be in November or October. So, okay. Does everyone have a copy? All right. So I was brainstorming, I was making connections, and I was pulling out themes, right? So the heart of my poem is the story about the boy pulling off my scarf, because that's ultimately what I want to write about. But within the story, within that narrative, right, I am going to be pulling details from some of these other things that are happening at the same time as my personal story. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'll read it to you and we'll talk about it. To the white boy who pulled off my hijab in 7th grade gym. Every morning you sat on those bleachers, dirty brown hair, Green Day t-shirt, ripped jeans, so desperate to screw your parents' money. Poor thing. You couldn't accept Coach Bell yelling at you. Change into gym shorts, bare your pretty pale legs, get in line, run faster, shoot straighter, stop being a wimp. While I got to run in long sleeves, jump hurdles in sweatpants, sit out of flag football the whole month of Ramadan. Got to pray in the principal's office, read my Quran during study hall. I defied rules in plain sight. In Latin class, I emerged as Artemis, virgin goddess of the hunt, sacred guard of chastity, bow and arrow in hand. I couldn't be grasped. Sometimes I'd catch you leaning on the goal post, arms folded, staring green-eyed right at me. That Thursday, you decided to figure me out, strolled past me and my girlfriends on the mats and smiled. You had a chipped tooth. I smiled back. A white boy. Never knew a white boy. At the Islamic schools, boys were black. They prayed in front, never talked to girls unless they were their sisters, and became men we'd grow to marry. But not you. So MTV. I laid my weapons down. You walked behind me, kneeled, and set your trap. Pretended to tie your shoe, rose, then grabbed my shoulder. I was caught. Placed your other hand on my head, snatched my hijab, and ran. I screamed as if someone had just cut me, placed my hands on my head to stop the bleeding. Turned to find you standing stiff, grin slowly leaving your face. My hair pulled into simple ponytail, bare to all. Black boys, white boys, they were pointing, oohing at what you revealed. Me, naked. I couldn't breathe. I ran for the locker room, ashamed, collapsed on the shower floor, crying. How could I leave when everyone had just seen me? The Quran says believers should lower their gaze. They should turn from the desire to see what should not be seen. I had wanted to see myself that entire year, turned away imaginings of my hair in your hand, skin a shade lighter than my own. A white boy. Never knew a white boy. I tried to keep it under wraps. You couldn't let me, could you? I wanted revenge like in the prophet's day. Chase you down, grab you from behind, tear out your tongue, cut off your hands, blind your eyes. But what would my father say? Away on pilgrimage, he was begging forgiveness for what he had seen, pleading God forgive those men who, months before, let their rage blow up a tower in Manhattan. How could I be a believer and wish to see that kind of rage? I had to forgive you. After class, I walked out of the locker room, arms over my head, makeshift scarf. Coach Bell handed me my hijab and sent us to the vice principal's office, where you confessed, said you didn't know it was such a big deal. You were suspended, then paddled repeatedly. I didn't stay to watch, but heard you scream through the door, grasping hard your punishment. I wanted to turn and scream back. Stop! He didn't know what he was doing. But the door's hard lines reminded me this was out of my control. I couldn't keep you from justice. Thank you. This was probably one of the hardest poems I've ever had to write. It was also an incredibly long revision process. I think I went through like 10 or 12 drafts of this poem. I've kept them all in like this super long Word document because I was trying to do this work of making all of these connections. And you know, it paid off. It's one of my favorite poems, but it was hard, right? Because I knew, and Nikki Finney knew, that there was more than just the narrative of, here's this boy, you know, he pulled off my scarf, I was ashamed, and he got suspended, right? And if we had time, I would have showed you the first draft, which was basically that. It was, I was in gym class, you walked up behind me, you pulled off my scarf, I was embarrassed, I cried, we went to the principal's office, you were paddled, the end, right? And so pushing the poem a little bit more, I think pulls out so many more elements. And this is gonna sound awkward, and I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, but if you look at the poem, let's talk about where do you see these other local and global things being tied into this experience of the scarf being pulled off? Anybody? Where do you see some phrase or image that is bigger than just that one moment? Where do we? The Hajj. Yeah.
And knowing that he would have wanted you to have forgiven, you know, your anger, natural reaction, kind of like someone, he would have told you, hey,
Calm down.
That was cool.
Yes, right. And that's exactly what my father would have done. He's a no nonsense, no emotion, just it is what it is, move on, right? And so that aspect of the father's religious pilgrimage, I was like, how am I gonna pull that in here, right? Well, I didn't really pull it in there like, oh, my dad said this to me when he came back from Hajj, right? He's kind of imaginary in this situation, right? So you don't have to take this so literally, right? The person doesn't have to be inserted in the narrative or the experience. It was more like me thinking about my father's influence on me, right, given this time period. And so this, this question of, but what would my father say, right? And I realized through some therapy, my father is definitely a representation of faith in my life, right? And so that's how I pulled him in to the story. Okay.
These first two bullets you have, fourth and fifth line of the second stanza, never knew a white boy. Mm-hmm. At the Islamic school, boys were black.
Yes, and so go ahead.
So that's, even though that's really significant background, it doesn't, the action is in the first stanza.
Yeah, and so when he's standing there, and then I take some time in that second stanza to kind of zoom out a little bit, right? And you taking time in the experience that you're telling to pause, right? And pull out something that seems to be a little bit bigger, right? And it's the fact that this boy was white. I had a crush on him, right? But it was also that fact that I had a crush on someone that I had never really integrated with, right? Because everybody was, Black or Somali or maybe Pakistani at this school. And so this is my first white boy crush. I'm like, oh my gosh, right? He might have, right? He was staring at me hard, right? Right, at the goal post, green-eyed. And he definitely had this chipped tooth. And so this aspect of race, right, and the other, right? Am I othering you? Is he othering me? Are we othering each other, right? And so this interest with the other person deepens the poem, where I would not have known, I wouldn't have thought about that in that first draft of the poem if I hadn't done the chart, right? That this is also significant because this is the first experience that I'm having with someone of a different race and religion, too.
I was going to say the part that really drew me in, too, is to see you. And I see you as this, because of your experience in Latin class, as this amazingly strong woman, but you let your guard down, which sounds so mythological.
Yes.
That's when the bad stuff happens.
Right, exactly. I will admit, I lucked out with that one, with that connection with the Artemis one. Like, oh my gosh, and Latin, that just was I don't want to say it was a fluke, but it was God or something like that. But yes, and that was the goddess. For anyone who's familiar with that myth, she like ends up unrobing or undressing, and some other man, I forget his name, sees her naked, and she like freezes him, or she does something terrible to him, right? And so I pulled in aspects of that myth, right? Because, hey, man, I actually liked you, right? I liked you, and you did something to me that is unforgivable and embarrassing, right? And so I wanted the revenge, which is also where I brought in the World Trade Center bombing of the aspect of revenge, because those terrorists were on that revenge mindset, right? And so again, that aspect of the World Trade Center bombing on that second page is very short, right? I didn't spend a lot of time, a whole stanza, talking about the terrorists or whatever, and I don't even think I used the word terrorist, right? So you can see how subtle the connections can be made, right? I said, forgive those men who attempted to blow up a tower, right? And so those two lines were just enough for me, I feel, to bring in this aspect of rage and make the global connection, right? Through the father and like my father and like broadening things. So now the poem is dealing with the experience of how do you forgive? How do you deal with faith and forgiveness? And how do you deal with this on a bigger scale when it comes to community? Because no longer am I just this one person, this one kid who had something happen to me. I'm now thinking about my father. I'm thinking about what my religion tells me to do, right? In light of forgiveness and being the victim. Right? So the poem, I think, opens up when it comes to the father and bringing in the World Trade Center bombing to bring up bigger questions about faith, revenge, forgiveness, and justice, too. How do we punish those people who do wrong to us, right? I wanted to save him, but the principal's like, no. This was back when you could still paddle people in school. Right. He says, no, you're getting paddled, right? And I couldn't stop anything. And Islam would probably say, no, he needs to be paddled too, right? So bringing up other questions about justice and just being okay with someone receiving what they kind of deserved in that moment. Like, we probably wouldn't do this now, right? We wouldn't paddle anyone now. I think that would be illegal.
So my question is, how much of his action was predicated on this fear of other that was going on, that continues to go on?
Right.
And how much of it was juveniles pulling on pigtails and not realizing that that meant he was laying you naked for a school full of strangers to look upon?
Great question. So to reiterate, the question is, how much did the guy know what he was doing, and how much was the curiosity that was not necessarily presented in the best form? And that's what I was trying to wrestle with towards the end, right? My desire to save him, right? And to say, stop, he didn't know what he was doing, right? In that moment, I'm thinking that same question. Well, maybe he didn't mean to do this to be cruel to me. Maybe he was intrigued. Maybe he had a crush on me too, right? I don't know the answer to that because I never talked to him afterwards, right? For the simple fact, I don't even know the boy's name. But it could have been both, right? And I think the poem is wrestling with my desire to kind of create a narrative and a happy ending for him. But a friend of mine was like, don't. When she saw one of the drafts of this, she was like, Aisha, you're still trying to save him, even in the way that you're talking about the poem. Because I ended up talking more about him for like 4 or 5 more lines at the end in one of the mini drafts. And she was like, stop trying to save him. He did something he shouldn't have done, and this was the consequence in the poem, right? In the poem, and just let that experience exist for what it is, right? Doesn't mean you have to hate him, right? But that was the poem. And the question still lingers. I don't know his intention. I can't really decide that for him, right?
I thought it was really excellent how you actually could have ended the poem with, because it would still be strong, but the Doors' hard lines reminded me this was out of my control. So I really appreciated you putting in, I couldn't keep you from justice.
Right.
That is just such a brilliant ending.
Yeah.
I was really impressed. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think that point speaks to the point that Celeste was bringing up, because there was another draft where it did end with the word control, right? And having that conversation with my friend where she was pushing me to just be okay with this boy being punished, this was more like me to tell myself, I can't keep you from justice, right? This is the type of justice that perhaps needed to happen, not like that type of justice at the World Trade Center bombing, right? I needed to step back and these were actual rules that you could get paddled, so, and let that take control, right? I didn't have to be the one to save you or to punish you, right, in this specific situation, but it had to happen.
And it also goes back to the title where you're very strong in your finish, that you're actually directly talking to the boy.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
Yes, right. Because I've never touched base with him again after this, so this is what I want to say to you, right? But yeah.
Yeah, you have been saying he did this, or, I wanted to, whatever, but you're saying you.
Yes.
It's like, it makes it much more powerful.
Last point, and then we'll wrap up.
I see some similarities here. Pop culturally, the Green Day T-shirts,
Yes.
Yeah.
and jeans, and so MTV.
Yes.
That's his appearance,
Mhm.
his apparel,
Yes.
if you will, to show that he is part of what's happening
Right.
at that time, and perhaps your hijab.
Mm-hmm.
That was also showed who you were at
Right.
that time through your religion versus pop culture.
Right.
So that stood out to me so clearly.
Yes.
So there are similarities
Mhm.
that we have
Mhm.
with each other, regardless of races, or beliefs or cultures. We just don't see it.
Right. Yes. And that's so well said, because in the process of writing this poem, I was able to see that, right? Like, very much Nirvana time frame, right? So he definitely had the long hair, and nobody dressed like that at the Islamic school. So I was like, whoa, that's so cool, right? So the aspect of appearance, the symbols that identify us, and so yes, as much as I say that the white boy should be punished, I also, in the writing process of this, realized that we were two people who were unfamiliar with each other, right? So that you can have some sympathy, but then you can also have justice too, right? One doesn't have to rule out the other, right? There could be both. So for the sake of time, I know we only have a few more minutes. I hope that this sample kind of showed you how this could end up happening. Again, it's a process. It may not happen instantaneously. And if we had more time, my goal was for us to actually start our own little column making process, right? Because in longer sessions, sometimes students are actually able to start that process and they're actually able to see, oh my gosh, this happened in 2002, right? Interesting. But I would love for you all to go home and try this process out to see what's actually enriching your experiences, and just be patient with that process. Right? So, thank you all very much. And here's my contact information if anyone would like to get in touch with me.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant. Thank you all for coming.
And I have books on sale if you would like to buy any. $10. Sure.
I very much enjoyed your classes. Thank you so much. Annie. I always pronounce her last name wrong, but you know Mary Solis, right? And then she at school. I thought she was teaching there too. Are you on Southwest Trafficway?
No, I'm at a different
Oh, a different one, okay.